Honourable Member for St. John's South, Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'll be splitting my time with the member, sir, for Davenport. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to say that, and as many Canadians know, this is not a newsflash, Mr. Speaker, Newfoundland and Labrador is a have province. In 2008, for the first time since Confederation in 1949, that's almost 60 years ago, we hit a milestone in that we stopped receiving equalization, where for years we were seen as a drain, a poor cousin of Canada, although that's most definitely debatable. I would say it was never the case, Mr. Speaker. Today we officially contribute more to the Confederation than we get back. Our confidence, our self-esteem as Newfoundlanders and Labradorians as who we are has improved. We're not cocky though, Mr. Speaker. We're not uppity. We look down on no one, Mr. Speaker. The memory of hard times isn't that far off, and it never seems to be that far away. And there are still, Mr. Speaker, there are still far too many people who aren't benefiting from the have status. It feels good to be a have province. We were always known across Canada as hard workers and proud of where we come from, but now, Mr. Speaker, we're just a little bit prouder. But, and here's the but, Mr. Speaker, in the wise words of one of my constituents, there are still too many have-not people. There are too many have-not families in a have province. Former Premier Brian Peckford once famously said that someday the sun would shine and have-not would be no more. Well, Mr. Speaker, the economic sun is finally shining in Newfoundland and Labrador, but there will always be have-nots. That's why I stand today, Mr. Speaker, in support of the motion by the Honourable Member for Rosemont-La Petite-Patrie that, in the opinion of the House, the government should reinstate the federal minimum wage and increase it incrementally to $15 an hour over 5 years. Mr. Speaker, at $10 an hour, the minimum wage in Newfoundland and Labrador is tied for lowest in the country, and we still have the highest unemployment rate of all provinces. There hasn't been an increase in the minimum wage in Newfoundland and Labrador since 2010. That will change next month, Mr. Speaker, when the minimum wage in my province will increase by 25 cents an hour. For a full-time minimum wage worker, that 25 cents extra an hour will increase, will work out over the course of a week to $10 a week, Mr. Speaker, which will buy 4 liters of milk. It will roughly buy about 4 liters of milk and a couple of loaves of bread. Not a lot, Mr. Speaker. A 25-cent an hour increase will not make much of a difference in the lives of our have-nots. The New Democratic Party of Newfoundland and Labrador is calling for a greater increase, Mr. Speaker, in the minimum wage. In August 2012, the Progressive Conservative government commissioned a report that recommended, Mr. Speaker, increasing the minimum wage and tying it to inflation and the Consumer Price Index. The Progressive Conservative government of Newfoundland and Labrador ignored that report, Mr. Speaker. So much for the Prime Minister's comment in question period today about how he would leave it to the provinces to set their own minimum wage. Provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador set a minimum wage and then ignore it. Newfoundland and Labrador New Democrats held a minimum wage town hall in St. John's earlier this month, coincidentally, Mr. Speaker, an event that drew too many stories of poverty. Let me quote Russell Cochran. He's a St. John's resident in his 20s who's worked several minimum wage jobs. Now, he said this at the St. John's Town Hall, quote, "It's degrading when you work a full-time job, you come out of it with only enough money to pay your rent and then have 1 week of groceries, wondering where you're going to eat for the second week. That hunger sticks, and it's a hunger that doesn't only degrade your body, it wears at your soul, it wears at your sense of self-worth. Mr. Speaker, the motion before this House today is a starting point. It's a starting point, Mr. Speaker, to address that degradation, to address that hunger, to address income inequality. By boosting standards for workers under federal jurisdiction, like banks and financial services, telecommunications, and broadcasting, the federal government can show leadership and set an example for provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador and improve wages across the country. Mr. Speaker, speaking of my home province, we have one of the highest percentages of minimum wage earners in Canada. In 2011, 9.7% of workers, or 19,700 workers, earned minimum wage. In Canada as a whole, only 6.8% earned minimum wage. Now, New Democrats believe that Canadians who work hard, Mr. Speaker, and who play by the rules should be able to make a decent living. Is that asking for too much, Mr. Speaker? It's not. Is that asking for too much here in Canada? Canada, Mr. Speaker, one of the richest countries in the world. Now, Mr. Speaker, we're not reinventing the wheel. There was, Mr. Speaker, a national federal minimum wage until 1996. What happened then, Mr. Speaker? The Liberals eliminated it, Mr. Speaker. Instead of doing the right thing and raising the federal minimum wage that had stagnated for a decade, the Liberals washed their hands of the problems and they killed the national minimum wage altogether. Now, in real terms, between 1975 and 2013, the average minimum wage increased by just 1 penny, Mr. Speaker, 1 cent. That means that workers earning the average minimum wage have only received a 1 cent raise over the past 40 years, even though, Mr. Speaker, our economy, the Canadian economy, has grown by leaps and bounds. Mr. Speaker, this motion to reinstate the federal minimum wage and increase it incrementally to $15 an hour over 5 years will have little impact, Mr. Speaker, on federal finances, as most federal employees already earn above the minimum wage. And most, Mr. Speaker, private sector workers under federal jurisdiction also make above the $15 an hour mark. But the reinstatement of a federal minimum wage will show, here's that word again, Mr. Speaker, leadership. It will show leadership and send a message to all provinces to follow suit. Mr. Speaker, income inequality in our country is spiraling out of control. The incomes of the top 1% are surging, Mr. Speaker, while the typical Canadian family has seen their income fall over the last 35 years. Over the last 35 years of mostly federal Liberal governments. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me summarize. No full-time worker in Canada should live in poverty. I repeat, no full-time worker in Canada should live in poverty. I challenge every member across the House, across the floor of the Commons, to stand up and disagree with that point. No full-time worker in Canada should live in poverty. In the words of Linda McQuaid, an author and journalist and recent New Democrat candidate, a $15 an hour federal minimum wage would be a bold step towards establishing that principle, that no full-time worker, Mr. Speaker, should live in poverty. Minimum wage jobs, they're not just for teenagers, Mr. Speaker, a way to occupy them after school and put spending money in their pockets. Minimum wage jobs are real jobs. They're real incomes that too many families depend on. Women, for example. Women are disproportionately minimum wage earners. In Newfoundland and Labrador, women make up 60.4% of minimum wage earners. 60.4%. Other minimum wage earners include immigrants, recent graduates, and too many others who can only find part-time work and need to hold down 2 or 3 jobs to survive. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me bring this speech home with another quote from the minimum wage town hall in St. John's earlier this month. Let me quote Ellen. Now, she's a Memorial University engineering student. The quote, here's the quote: "We need to stop being cheerleaders for the most wealthy interests in our society and stick up for someone else who needs it. More and more people in this country need sticking up for, Mr. Speaker. More and more, the gap between the rich and the poor in this country is widening. Mr. Speaker, from the world's perspective, Canada is a have country. Few countries have what we have. But it's the have-nots that we have to look out for, Mr. Speaker. If the measure of a great country is how well it looks after its most vulnerable, then we've fallen short under successive Conservative and Liberal administrations before it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Don Valley West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his comments. But as I listen to him, and I understand his impassioned presentation, but I think he's got the argument backwards. He talks about leadership, and leadership is in demonstrating change that will ensure change happens through tax cuts, through tax credits, through leadership and job creation in the economy and economic growth. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the honourable member, as he considers the data and his argument, I'd like him to source where he finds these numbers that he's been discussing, the volume of people, the numbers of people, because we see minimal numbers that would be impacted by this particular motion and supported by the third party, I might add. And Mr. Speaker, I think that in fact they're working from either flawed data or no data, and I'd ask that he just confirm what's it going to do for numbers, where do they get their numbers, and more importantly, what are we going to do for youth with this motion, because I don't see it.
The Honourable Member for St. John's South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member across the way for the question. The Prime Minister of Canada was asked a question in today's question period, and this is going to respond to the honourable member's question about leadership. The Prime Minister was asked a question today about a national minimum wage and whether or not he would agree to it, whether he would agree to the new Democratic proposal that we have a national minimum wage of $15 an hour to be set over the next 5 years. And basically what the Prime Minister said, and again comes back to leadership, is that he would leave it to the provinces. But the example that I gave in my speech, again coming back to leadership, is how the province of Newfoundland and Labrador set up an inquiry in 2012 to have a look into the provincial minimum wage, and it recommended increasing the minimum wage. And what did the progressive conservative government of Newfoundland and Labrador do with that recommendation, Mr. Speaker? They ignored it. So the Prime Minister and the Conservatives have an opportunity to show leadership across this country, and what do they fail to do yet again, Mr. Speaker? Show leadership.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Labrador.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his remarks today and the motion that he's put forward. I think all of us in this House will agree that no family, no individual should ever live in poverty in this country. We're a country of tremendous wealth and opportunity. However, Mr. Speaker, we know that those cases do exist, and I think wherever possible, government has to show leadership to industry, business, and society in general, that doing the right thing always pays off. I would ask my colleague today, how many people employed within the federal service works for less than $15 an hour, and how will this increase impact those individuals if it's not going to be rolled out only over a period of 5 years? Will the inflation rate at that time have contributed to the necessity of a higher increased wage?
The Honourable Member for St. John's South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the honourable member for Labrador for the question. As I outlined in my speech, Mr. Speaker, the number of federal government employees or the number of private sector employees across Canada who are federally regulated, who make under $15 an hour, they're few and far between, Mr. Speaker. This is a symbolic move. Again, referring to my last answer, this is an opportunity for the Conservatives, for the Prime Minister of Canada to show leadership across this country, to show leadership for the provinces, and set the bar in terms of minimum wage. But again, the Conservative government is failing to set the bar. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.